Hi guys, it's Kirsty and my glamorous assistant Banjo, and today I want to talk through the OCD themes that I have experienced and some of the approaches I took to tackle them. But first I'd like to ask, please do subscribe by clicking on the button below in order to stay up to date with all of the new videos as they're released. So the first theme that I will talk about quite briefly, because I've done quite a few videos on this, is relationship OCD. So this was the theme that I suffered from most severely, and it's the theme that led me to start reading up about OCD and led me to realise that that was what I was struggling with. Prior to that, I'd had some themes come and go, but nothing had latched on quite so severely as that. Even some of the health obsessions that I had experienced. So with relationship OCD, the things that helped me were identifying the main core fears that were driving it. And there wasn't just one core fear here. And I realised that as I started to work through and my fears, and I started to improve a little bit, I was still finding that the theme was staying kind of the same, but thoughts were changing and it was still staying hooked. So firstly, I approached the fear of losing my partner, basically just examining, the fact that the whole world wouldn't fall apart. It wouldn't be as awful as I was making it out to be. I was very much awfulizing it because I value the relationship very much, when in fact, actually, it would be tolerable. And this is where I had to show myself that it would be tolerable, because I'd got through previous breakups before and I'd lived my life for 29 years before I met my partner. So, I could live without him. As ideally, I didn't want to. I wanted to stay with him. But if we did break up, I could stand it, and it wouldn't be this big, awful tragedy that I was building up to be in my mind. And then I noticed it was, still sticking, and after a while it was changing a little bit, but okay, what if I stay with him and I'm doing the wrong thing, and am I leading him on? And then so here you start to, want to look into other fears. Is your fear missing out potentially on, what else might be there if you are making a mistake or something? So you start to think, well, actually, again, that's not awful either, because I have a pretty good life where I am. And if I choose to stay, regardless of my reasons for staying, that doesn't make me an awful person. I don't have to feel a certain way just because society or Hollywood says that I should feel a certain way. Because here you might start to have your anxiety go down when you bring down the fear of losing your partner, but then you start to worry if that means that you don't actually care and that you should leave. It's a bit of a backdoor spike there, and you use your numbness as evidence, essentially, that it's not OCD. So here it's kind of starting to examine the fact that you don't need to feel a certain way, and you can accept yourself for whatever reason you choose to stay with your partner, even if it isn't what society or everybody else says you should be using as a reason to stay in a relationship. So you start to show yourself that you can accept yourself regardless, so there's even less material for OCD to grip onto. And then finally, it unhooked a lot, but then I'd still get times when I feel really down and I'll get anxiety for no reason. And I realised that it was the fear of fear here. And so it was definitely that was what was keeping me still stuck on having some ROCD thoughts, even though I felt quite confident that I wasn't scared of those other two things anymore. It was the fear of OCD itself and getting stuck again, and my OCD getting worse or not getting any better from where it was. So then you start to look at, are you awfulizing having OCD itself? And you can start to look at the things that you can still do in your life and the things that you can, OCD, it can make us feel a certain way, but it can't stop us doing things. So if we still choose to do the things we want to do, then we're doing all we can to make sure that we're not going to be missing out, and we can still get some pleasure from these things. So it's not as awful as we can make it out to be. And as your themes start to change, when your OCD kind of on an original theme, like for example with me with ROCD, as OCD started to lose its hold over me there, it started to move around more the other themes. So one theme that I definitely had kind of alongside ROCD actually as I started to recover was worrying that I had various other mental health conditions that, like, not necessarily OCD. So I started to have obsessions that maybe I had bipolar, and then it would latch on when I was, you know, feeling good, you know, when I was having maybe a slightly better day with my OCD and I was feeling in a better mood, or I was feeling excited, I would start having thoughts that that was me being, you know, having a manic episode, and that I would lose control. And so, you know, it's still OCD wanting me to stay, you know, very much firmly in control of things. And then some days I might have the odd thought. This wasn't a big sticking one for me, but psychosis as well, because OCD is really confusing. One day you think one thing, another day you think another, and it makes you question yourself and your, you know, how well your brain's working. And so psychosis was one that flipped in and out. And another one was borderline personality disorder, which was something that I was kind of, I would sometimes think, am I having these thoughts actually because I have that? So I'd find myself, you know, reading up on these things a little bit. And my approach to this was, firstly, I think a part of it was because I didn't want these things to stick, and it was a fear of OCD. So it was that approach again, like, you know, realising that I could still enjoy my life even whilst having, you know, OCD is still affecting me. But also I started to think, okay, well, if it was any of these things, I am now familiar with mindfulness, which I wasn't previously. I was taking medication, so I thought, well, you know, maybe the medication would help with these things as well, or I could look at a new medication for these particular things I might be struggling with, if so needs be. I was still doing things that I needed to do to take care of myself, which would be applicable to any mental health condition, not just OCD, you know, eating well, exercise, making sure I was socialising, keeping busy, within reason. And then also I thought, well, I'm working on exposures, and I'm working on challenging irrational beliefs, which would probably still, well, most certainly would be relevant for other mental health conditions. So then I realised, okay, well, it wouldn't be so awful, and I could stand it. You know, OCD has been pretty damn hard, what I'd experienced of it. So if I had something else, I could stand it. And while you go through these different themes, it might be that you do some exposures that are relevant to them. Like, for example, watching YouTube documentaries, as long as that isn't becoming compulsive. But, you know, these are things to discuss with your therapist or OCD coach. And then other things would be, so health overall was a big thing that latched on. So again, it was, and that was a huge theme for me, on and off. And it was something that was quite ongoing throughout my 20s. But I was able to always prove it wrong with doctor's appointments, which I now realise was compulsive. So here it would be, you know, challenging the idea. It would be awful if I developed, you know, insert certain illness into the blank. And you know, you want to bring this down. You want to give good reasons. And what you can say is, here, for me, my believing and holding on tightly to the irrational belief that it would be awful if I had one of these illnesses was something that was, it was reducing my quality of life because I was so scared of it. So, you know, surely if somebody did have one of these illnesses, they want to live the best life they can, and letting go of believing that that's so awful, or can allow them to live their life to the best they can and have as much pleasure as possible in their life. And that was something I realised I'd be reducing for myself if I held on to this belief. So I started to challenge it this way. And then as I started to work my way through ROCD, health, and other mental health, you know, difficulties latching on, one that's been coming in and out was harm, you know, whether that's sort of thinking about hurting other people, you know, fears of, you know, what harm you might cause, whether that's accidental or whether it's that you lose control and suddenly snap. That's been the main one for me. What if I was to, you know, black out or something, and being afraid of that. So again, with these, you know, harm, there's plenty of exposures you can do. And again, I recommend discussing that with your OCD coach or therapist. But in terms of disputing the rationality of this, is that somebody who chooses to inflict harm on other people clearly is not necessarily in the right mind. And if you were to, you know, there's only so much you can do to not lose consciousness and do something. There's not, if that's going to happen and something is going to go wrong in your brain to make that happen, there's not a whole lot you can do to stop that happening. I mean, like avoiding places or avoiding things or saying things over and over to yourself in your mind is not going to stop that thing going wrong in your head that would make that happen. So you realise that what you need to do is start to, you know, bring down how much you believe that you must control this situation, because actually you can't. You want to aim not to hurt anyone. It's not helpful for anyone. It wouldn't make you feel good, wouldn't make them feel good. It's not helpful in your life. It's just, you definitely don't want to be doing that. But if something snapped and you couldn't control it, it wouldn't completely write you off as a human being, because it's not necessarily something you would control, and it's not necessarily something that you would choose to do. So that was kind of how I approached that, because that was my particular thing. That would be like, you know, what if I was to just, you know, lose control or black out and it was, or something. So it was kind of looking at the fact that if that was to happen, I wouldn't necessarily be able to control it anyway. So any attempts that I make to control it are futile. And, you know, and in order to help me get behind that is to truly work on the belief that I would not be 100% awful person if that happened. It would be a bad act, and certainly a regrettable act, but it wouldn't make me the worst person in the world. And perhaps I could practice, you know, accepting myself if that was to happen and something was to go wrong in my brain, and I did that. So that was one of my approaches to that particular obsession. And then there have been certain small things that have latched on along the way. So during my OCD recovery, I've also tried to build my confidence with certain things, my self-belief. And then I'd start to have thoughts that I can't be arrogant. And then if I had a confident thought, I'd think that was bad because I'm being arrogant. So then it's like starting to work on how can I, you know, it's really not that awful if I am arrogant, just because it's not something I necessarily find massively attractive in people. If I was to be arrogant, it doesn't make me awful. It doesn't make anybody else awful. It's just, you know, and sometimes we can feel a bit arrogant and other times we might not. It doesn't make you officially arrogant. So it's starting to look at, just because somebody behaves in an arrogant way from time to time, it doesn't make them completely arrogant. And that can apply to various other, you know, perhaps personality traits as well. So another thing that I suppose this falls under the other mental health difficulty umbrella, but thinking, am I narcissistic? If I'm thinking about myself a lot, or, you know, or if I have certain thoughts that I've read can be a bit narcissistic. Just because I think in a narcissistic way, maybe from time to time, it doesn't make me 100% a narcissist. So it's kind of like, you don't have to label yourself and other people in their absolute entirety just because on one or two occasions they behave in a certain way or they exhibit slight, you know, some traits that are a bit like that. It doesn't make them 100% one way or another. There is a grey area, and it's good for us to apply that to ourselves as well, because OCD can absolutely latch on to these kind of small things. If it's something that we don't, you know, necessarily want to be, it can latch on to that, you know. you know, in terms of morals as well, in terms of how we handle situations with people. I've certainly had OCD latch onto that, and I found myself asking for reassurance that I handled the situation correctly. And here it was, you know, well, if you didn't, it's not so awful, you know. And then it's sort of going back to the core fears there, which are making you want to examine the way you've behaved on that occasion, and if it was completely the right way to behave. And more often than not, there is no black and white answer in terms of how you behave, because one person might think it was, you know, oh, that sounds reasonable to me. Another person might think, oh God, I think you're a bit out of order there. And that all comes down to perspective again. And again, our perspective can change so much in short spaces of time, depending on what experiences we've had and the new things that we would have learned that might change our perspective overnight if we learned something new information that we didn't already previously know. So with all of these things, it was starting to develop more flexibility in my thinking, particularly about me as a person and what I could kind of, you know, live with, and showing myself compassion if I wasn't necessarily always able to behave or think or anything in a completely what I would have thought, you know, ideal or perfect way. And again, with all of these things, you're not saying this is definitely the case, this is me. You're saying if this was me, I could accept it. You know, you're not saying this is me. It's as we've said before, acceptance isn't agreement. It's saying if this was the case, this worst case scenario, this thing that my mind is saying about me, I could still do this, that, and the other, or I've still, you know, I've still done some good acts, or everything I do isn't always as bad as that. So you start to see that there's black and white territory. There's grey, territory there. It's not necessarily black and white, and we don't have to label ourselves as one thing. So that is another thing that's helped the smaller kind of themes that I've had stop latching on quite so much. I hope this video has been useful, and yeah, so you know, if you've had any one of those themes or a mixture of all of them, you can see, or if you're having changing themes, you can see how easily they can change and maybe why they change as well. And in my experience, changing themes is particularly when you start to learn more about OCD and you start to be a bit scared of OCD itself. That was what I found. But anyway, I hope this has been useful for you. Happy New Year and take care. Bye.